A sterile noblewoman was given to a mountain man as punishment by her father, but he made her the mother of triplets. Hello, my dear friend. This is Jasper Ashwood, your narrator of Mountain Tales. Before we start, make sure you subscribe and drop a comment below telling me where you're tuning in from. A big hug to you all, and I hope you enjoy the story. The bitter wind howled through Fort Laramie, a remote trading post on the edge of the Rocky Mountain wilderness, where civilization ended and the untamed frontier began. Lady Catherine Harrington stood rigid in the morning cold, her fine woolen traveling cloak doing little to protect her from either the weather or the humiliation burning through her chest. Her gloved hands trembled, but she kept her chin raised, refusing to show weakness before the assembled trappers, traders, and military men who had gathered to witness her disgrace. "This is your punishment, Catherine," Lord Edmund Harrington declared, his voice cutting through the icy air like a blade. His face was carved from stone, betraying no hint of paternal affection or mercy. 7 years of failed marriages, 7 years of physicians confirming what I already knew. You are barren, useless to our family line, incapable of fulfilling the one purpose for which a woman of your station exists. Catherine's throat tightened, but she swallowed the words that wanted to spill forth. At 26 years old, she had endured 3 brief marriages, each ending in annulment after physicians declared her incapable of bearing children. 3 public humiliations, 3 times sent back to her father's house in shame, while rumors spread throughout Boston society about the defective Harrington daughter who couldn't perform a woman's most basic duty. "Ezekiel Thornton," her father continued, addressing the tall figure standing several paces away, nearly invisible in his buckskin clothing and heavy fur coat. "As we agreed in our correspondence, I offer my daughter as settlement for your services to the territorial government. She will serve your household in whatever capacity you deem appropriate." Catherine's eyes finally rose to look at the mountain man her father had bartered her to like cattle. Ezekiel Thornton stood well over 6 feet tall, his frame broad and powerful beneath the rough frontier clothing. His face was weathered by sun and wind, his jaw covered in a thick, dark beard, shot through with silver. His eyes, a startling pale blue against his tanned skin, studied her with an expression she couldn't decipher. Unlike her father's contemptuous stare or the pitying glances of society physicians, his gaze held something different, a measuring quality that seemed to look past her expensive clothing and see something deeper. "She comes with appropriate documentation," Lord Harrington added, pulling papers from his coat and handing them to the fort commander, who would serve as witness. "Medical attestations confirming her condition, along with formal release of all familial obligations and inheritance rights. She is yours now, to dispose of as you see fit." The mountain man stepped forward, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. He was close enough now that Catherine could see the details of his weathered face, the scar running along his left cheekbone, the silver threading through his dark hair, which hung past his shoulders. He took the documents without looking at them, folded them once and tucked them inside his coat. "Father, please," Catherine finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't do this. Send me to a convent. Let me serve as a governess somewhere distant. I'll disappear from society entirely, just don't—" "Silence," Lord Harrington snapped. "You've had every opportunity to prove your value as a woman. You've consumed my resources, damaged our family name, and provided nothing in return. Now you'll learn what it means to be truly worthless, to serve a man who has no use for social graces or empty sophistication." He mounted his horse, the animal stamping nervously in the cold. "Mr. Thornton has paid good coin for supplies and provisions to make up for your inevitable inadequacies. I suggest you learn quickly how to make yourself useful, or you'll find mountain winters far less forgiving than Boston society." Catherine watched as her father rode away without a backward glance, his retinue following behind. The fort commander cleared his throat awkwardly, muttered something about official business, and retreated to the warmth of the fort's interior. Within moments, Catherine stood alone with the mountain man, the February wind whipping her cloak around her legs, the vast emptiness of the frontier stretching endlessly beyond the fort's wooden walls. Ezekiel moved past her toward 2 pack horses loaded with supplies, his movements economical and purposeful. He checked the ropes securing the cargo, tested the animal's hooves, adjusted a saddle. Catherine stood frozen, uncertain what was expected of her, uncertain what her life had just become. Without looking at her, the mountain man spoke for the first time. His voice was low, roughened by years in the wilderness, but not unkind. "Can you ride?" Yes, I can ride," Catherine answered, surprised by the practical question. "Good. We've got 4 days' travel ahead. Storm's coming in tomorrow night. We need to make the first range before it hits." He gestured toward a smaller horse, a sturdy brown mare with kind eyes. "That's Clover. She's steady, won't throw you. We leave in 10 minutes. Take care of any necessities now." Catherine's cheeks burned at the blunt reference to bodily needs, but she recognized the practical wisdom. This wasn't Boston, where delicate euphemisms disguised natural functions. This was survival. She hurried to the fort's facilities, changed from her traveling dress into the more practical, divided riding skirt her maid had secretly packed, and returned to find Ezekiel waiting patiently beside the horses. He helped her mount without comment, his hands strong but careful, and then swung onto his own horse, a massive black gelding that looked capable of carrying his considerable frame across any terrain. They rode out of Fort Laramie as snow began to fall, heading west toward mountains that rose like jagged teeth against the pale sky. For hours they traveled in silence, the only sounds the crunch of hooves on frozen ground, the creak of leather, the occasional snort from the horses. Catherine had expected cruelty, demands, perhaps violence. Her father had spoken of mountain men as barely civilized, rough creatures living outside society's rules. But Ezekiel Thornton simply rode ahead, occasionally checking to ensure she followed, his attention focused on the trail and the darkening weather. As afternoon faded toward evening, he guided them to a sheltered spot beneath a rock overhang, a natural cave that offered protection from the rising wind. He dismounted, began unpacking supplies, building a fire with practiced efficiency. Catherine climbed down from Clover, her legs shaking after hours in the saddle, her hands stiff with cold despite her gloves. "There's a stream 30 paces that way," Ezekiel said, pointing north. "Water's clean. Canteens need filling." It was a task, a purpose. Catherine took the canteens and made her way through the darkening trees to find the stream, its water running cold and clear over smooth stones. When she returned, a fire blazed cheerfully, and the mountain man was arranging their camp with the methodical care of someone who had done this thousands of times. He showed her where to spread her bedroll, far enough from the fire to avoid sparks, but close enough to benefit from its warmth. He shared dried venison and hard biscuits without ceremony, along with strong tea brewed in a battered tin pot. They ate in silence, and Catherine found herself stealing glances at this man who had purchased her like property, yet treated her with distant courtesy. "Your father said you're barren," Ezekiel finally spoke, his eyes on the fire. "That true? Or just his excuse to be rid of an inconvenient daughter?" The question was so direct it stole Catherine's breath. No one had ever asked her that. Not the physicians who examined her, not the husbands who divorced her, not the society matrons who whispered behind their fans. They all simply accepted the diagnosis and her subsequent worthlessness. 3 different physicians confirmed it, she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "My body there's something wrong inside. I'll never bear children. I'm useless," Ezekiel finished, his tone neutral. "That what they told you?" "It's what everyone knows," Catherine replied, surprised by the bitterness in her own voice. "A woman who can't bear children has no value. I've been examined, measured, discussed like a prize mare that won't breed. My father spent thousands trying to fix me, 3 marriages wasted on a defective daughter." The mountain man was quiet for a long moment, his pale eyes reflecting firelight. "Out here," he finally said, "a person's worth isn't measured by one thing. Seen plenty of folks who could make babies but couldn't make a life. Seen others who built something real without ever having children of their own." He poured more tea into her cup. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be harder." That night, wrapped in blankets that smelled of wood smoke and pine, Catherine stared up at stars visible through gaps in the rock overhang. She was property now, owned by a stranger, heading into a wilderness that cared nothing for her Boston education or her family name. Yet the mountain man's words circled through her mind, suggesting possibilities she had never been allowed to consider. Perhaps worth could be measured differently here, in this vast empty land where survival mattered more than social standing. The storm hit the next afternoon, a howling blizzard that turned the world white and deadly. Ezekiel guided them with uncanny sureness. Reading landscape features, Catherine couldn't even see through the driving snow. When they finally reached a small cabin nestled in a protected valley, Catherine was numb with cold. barely able to dismount. The mountain man lifted her down as easily as lifting a child, carried her inside, and set her near a fireplace he quickly kindled to blazing life. "Stay there," he ordered, then disappeared back into the storm to tend the horses. Catherine huddled by the fire, feeling returning to her frozen limbs in painful prickles. She looked around the cabin, a single room with a sleeping loft, rough-hewn furniture, and shelves lined with supplies, tools, and books. Books, dozens of them, their spines worn from reading. Medicine texts, natural philosophy, journals of mountain exploration, even poetry. The discovery startled her. This wasn't the hovel of an ignorant savage. This was the home of someone who valued learning, who spent winter nights reading by firelight. Ezekiel returned covered in snow, his beard crusted with ice. He shed his outer layers, hung them to dry, and began preparing a hot meal, venison stew with root vegetables, beans, and herbs that filled the cabin with delicious aromas. As they ate, Catherine found her courage returning. "Why did you agree to my father's arrangement?" she asked. "You seem capable of managing well on your own. Why burden yourself with an unwanted woman?" The mountain man studied her over the rim of his cup. "Your father owed the territorial government for services I rendered. He offered money, but I don't have much use for money out here. He offered you instead, figured I'd refuse and he'd be free of the debt." A slight smile tugged at his bearded mouth. "I accepted because it was either take you or let him win his game. Seemed wrong to leave you to whatever else he had planned." "So I'm revenge against my father?" Catherine asked, unsure whether to feel relieved or insulted. "You're a person," Ezekiel replied simply. "Figured you deserved better than being discarded. What happens next is up to you. You can stay here, learn to survive, make yourself useful in whatever way suits you. Or come spring, I'll escort you to any settlement you choose, set you up with enough money to start fresh somewhere." Catherine looked around the cabin, at the warmth and shelter it provided, at the man who had offered her something no one else ever had. Choice. "I don't know anything useful," she admitted. "I can read, write, play piano, manage household staff, but I don't know how to survive here. I don't know how to do anything practical." "Then you'll learn," Ezekiel said. "Same as everyone else who comes to the mountains. You'll make mistakes, but you'll learn. Question is whether you want to." Over the following weeks, as winter locked the mountains in snow and ice, Catherine discovered reserves of strength she never knew she possessed. Ezekiel proved to be a patient but exacting teacher, showing her how to maintain fires, prepare game, preserve food, identify medicinal plants from his dried winter stores, mend clothing and equipment. He taught her to read weather signs, to conserve resources, to do a dozen tasks that Boston society would have considered beneath a lady's dignity. She failed often. The first bread she baked was inedible, hard as stone. The first deer hide she tried to scrape was ruined by her inexperienced hands. But Ezekiel never mocked her failures. He simply showed her again, adjusted her technique, and let her try once more. Slowly, painfully, Catherine's soft hands grew calloused. Her body, used to servants and leisure, adapted to constant work. More importantly, her spirit, crushed by years of being told she was worthless, began to strengthen as she mastered each new skill. One evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Ezekiel pulled down one of his medical texts and opened it to a section on fertility and women's health. "These doctors who examined you," he said without preamble, "what exactly did they say was wrong?" Catherine felt heat rise to her face. Such topics weren't discussed in polite company, certainly not between unmarried men and women, but this was no longer Boston, and Ezekiel's expression was purely clinical, the look of someone seeking information rather than gossip. "They said my womb was tilted incorrectly, that my monthly courses were irregular, that I had some kind of deficiency in my feminine humors," she recited, the diagnoses she'd heard so many times. They tried various treatments, tonics, dietary restrictions, even leeches. Nothing worked. 3 marriages, years of trying, and nothing. Ezekiel read through the medical text, his finger tracing lines of technical language. "Most of this is speculation," he finally said. "Medical science doesn't know half as much as it pretends. I've seen Indian healers work miracles that would baffle any university doctor. I've seen women told they were barren go on to have children. I've seen men told they were dying live another 30 years. Are you suggesting the doctors were wrong?" Catherine asked, not daring to hope. "I'm suggesting they're human, and humans make mistakes, Ezekiel replied. I'm also suggesting that stress, fear, and being told you're worthless might affect a body more than some supposed tilt in your womb. He closed the book. Out here, away from all that poison, your body might heal itself, or it might not. Either way, you're more than your ability to bear children. Spring came slowly to the mountains, winter releasing its grip reluctantly. As snow melted and streams swelled with runoff, Catherine discovered a transformation in herself. The pale, soft Boston lady who had arrived at Fort Laramie no longer existed. In her place stood a woman with sun-browned skin, strong, capable hands, and eyes that could read the landscape the way Ezekiel had taught her. She could track game, identify edible plants, dress a deer, set snares, and do 100 other tasks that would have horrified her former social circle. More significantly, she had discovered purpose. Ezekiel's cabin was on a route occasionally traveled by other mountain men, traders, and occasionally Indian tribes passing through the region. Catherine's Boston education, combined with the medical knowledge Ezekiel shared from his books, made her valuable in unexpected ways. She could read and write for illiterate trappers, help with basic medicine and midwifery, serve as translator when her facility with languages proved useful. She began to see herself not as a burden, but as a partner in this wilderness life. The relationship between Catherine and Ezekiel evolved slowly, built on respect and companionship rather than romance. They talked for hours by firelight, sharing stories of their pasts. She learned he had been a physician's assistant in Philadelphia, before the death of his young wife in childbirth drove him to the mountains, seeking solace in solitude. He had spent 17 years in the wilderness, becoming part of it, belonging to it in ways that made civilization feel foreign. "Why did you never remarry?" Catherine asked one night. "You're still young enough, only 43. You could have found another wife, had more children." Ezekiel was quiet, staring into the flames. "Sarah died because I couldn't save her. I had all the medical knowledge, all the instruments, and I couldn't save her or our son. After that, I couldn't face the idea of watching another woman I loved go through childbirth, risk death, for my sake." He looked at Catherine. "That's why your father's offer intrigued me. A wife who couldn't bear children meant a wife who couldn't die that way." "That's why you took me?" Catherine asked, feeling something shift in her chest. "Not pity, but protection from your own fear." "Partly," Ezekiel admitted. "Also because you reminded me of Sarah, not in looks, but in your eyes. That same desperate strength, trying to be brave while your world collapsed. I couldn't save her, but maybe I could offer you a different life." Summer transformed the mountain valley into a paradise of wildflowers and abundant game. Catherine thrived in the warmth, her body growing strong from constant activity. She established a small garden near the cabin, growing vegetables and herbs. She improved her skills with firearms, becoming a decent shot. She even began accompanying Ezekiel on his longer expeditions, learning to navigate the wilderness with increasing confidence. It was during one of these expeditions, camped beside a crystal stream under a full moon, that everything changed. They had been tracking elk for 3 days, and their successful hunt had put them both in high spirits. As they sat by the fire, Ezekiel suddenly reached over and took Catherine's hand, his work-roughened thumb tracing the calluses on her palm. "You've become quite the mountain woman," he said softly. "When you first arrived, I wondered if you'd last a month. Now I can't imagine this valley without you." Catherine's heart hammered in her chest. Over the months, her feelings for Ezekiel had deepened from gratitude to respect to something far more profound. But she had never dared imagine he might feel the same. "I never thanked you properly," she said, her voice shaking slightly, "for saving me, for teaching me, for showing me I could be more than what my father said I was." "You saved yourself," Ezekiel replied. "I just gave you space to do it." He shifted closer, his pale blue eyes intense in the firelight. "Catherine, I know the circumstances that brought you here weren't ideal. I know you didn't choose this life or this man. But I'm asking now as a choice, would you consider staying permanently? Not as property or convenience, but as my wife." Catherine felt tears sting her eyes, but they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "I can't give you children," she reminded him, needing him to understand completely. "The physicians were unanimous. I'll never be able to—" "I don't care," Ezekiel interrupted gently. "I told you. I don't measure worth by that. You're strong, intelligent, capable, and you've made this lonely cabin into a home. That's more than enough for me." "Then yes," Catherine whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you, not because I have no other choice, but because I choose you." They were married by a traveling preacher who happened through the territory in late summer, a simple ceremony with only a handful of trappers and friendly Shoshone tribesmen as witnesses. Catherine wore a dress she had sewn herself from traded fabric, and Ezekiel trimmed his beard for the occasion. It wasn't the grand society wedding her father had imagined for her, but it was real, built on genuine affection rather than social obligation. The months that followed were among the happiest of Catherine's life. She and Ezekiel settled into true partnership, sharing work and decisions equally. She expanded her garden, learned to preserve foods for winter, and continued developing her medical knowledge, becoming the de facto healer for trappers and tribesmen in the region. Ezekiel built additions to their cabin, creating space for Catherine's work and their growing collection of supplies and books. Winter came again, and they weathered it together, secure in their mountain home. As spring approached once more, Catherine noticed changes in her body. At first, she attributed them to the rich venison stew they had been living on, or perhaps some digestive complaint, but as the signs became unmistakable, a terrifying, impossible hope began to grow. When she finally shared her suspicion with Ezekiel, he was immediately concerned. "Are you certain?" he asked, his physician's instincts engaging. "Your courses have always been irregular. It might be nothing," Catherine agreed, her hand pressed to her abdomen. "But, Ezekiel, I felt something. Movement. It's faint, but it's there." Over the next weeks, they monitored her condition carefully, both afraid to believe, yet unable to deny the evidence. Catherine's body changed in ways that couldn't be explained by anything else. Her abdomen swelled, not with fat, but with something firmer. The movements she felt grew stronger, more frequent, and one evening, when Ezekiel placed his experienced hands on her belly, his eyes went wide. "Catherine," he breathed, wonder and fear warring in his voice. "There's more than one heartbeat." The realization hit them both like lightning. Not only was Catherine carrying a child despite all medical pronouncements of her sterility, she was carrying multiple children. As the weeks passed and her condition became undeniable, Ezekiel estimated she might be carrying triplets, an occurrence so rare that it seemed almost miraculous. The pregnancy terrified them both. Ezekiel, haunted by his first wife's death, was nearly paralyzed by fear. Catherine, so certain of her inability to conceive, could barely believe her own body. They prepared obsessively, Ezekiel reading every medical text he owned, Catherine following every precaution they could imagine. They sent word to Fort Laramie hoping to arrange for medical assistance, but spring storms made travel impossible. They would face this alone. When labor began on a warm June morning, Ezekiel's hands shook as he prepared his medical supplies. Catherine, surprisingly, found herself filled with calm determination. She had survived Boston's cruelty, the mountain's harshness, and her own self-doubt. She would survive this too. The labor was long and difficult, stretching through the entire day and into the night. Ezekiel coached her through each contraction, his medical knowledge combining with deep love to give him steadiness. And then, just before midnight, their first child emerged crying into the world, a tiny but perfectly formed girl with her father's pale blue eyes. "One," Ezekiel announced, tears streaming down his face as he cleaned and wrapped the infant. But there was no time to rest. The second child followed 20 minutes later. Another girl, this one with her mother's darker coloring. And then, as dawn broke over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, the third child arrived, a boy, completing their impossible family. Catherine lay exhausted but radiant, a daughter cradled in each arm, while Ezekiel held their son, all three adults staring in wonder at the three tiny miracles that logic said shouldn't exist. "You did it," Ezekiel whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. "You brought them all safely into the world." "We did it," Catherine corrected, reaching to touch her husband's face. "Together." In the days that followed, as Catherine recovered and the triplets began to thrive, word spread throughout the territory of the sterile noblewoman who had borne 3 healthy children to the mountain man who loved her. The story took on legendary qualities, whispered around campfires and in trading posts from Fort Laramie to the Pacific coast. A messenger arrived from Fort Laramie with news that created its own kind of miracle. Lord Edmund Harrington had died of apoplexy 3 months prior, upon receiving news that his disgraced, discarded daughter had not only survived the wilderness, but had given birth to 3 healthy grandchildren he would never meet. His will, written in bitterness, had attempted to disinherit Catherine completely, but the courts ruled it invalid due to his prior legal abandonment of her. His considerable estate, lacking any other heirs, reverted to Catherine as his only surviving child. "We're wealthy," Catherine said, reading the letter with bemusement. "According to this, I've inherited everything. The Boston house, the investments, everything." She looked at Ezekiel, who was bouncing their son gently while the girls slept in their cradle. "We could go back east, live in comfort, hire servants to help with the children." Ezekiel was quiet for a long moment, then smiled. "Or we could stay here, in the home we built together, and use that money to help others who need a fresh start in the territories. Build a real settlement with a school and proper medical facility. Make this valley into something permanent." Catherine looked around their cabin, at the triplets who shouldn't exist, at the man who had seen value where others saw only worthlessness, at the life they had carved from wilderness and determination. "I'd like that," she said. "This is home now. This is where we belong." Years passed, and the valley that had been Ezekiel Thornton's solitary refuge became a thriving settlement. Using Catherine's inheritance wisely, they established a community that welcomed those seeking new beginnings, outcasts and dreamers, people running from pasts that had judged them too harshly. Catherine became the settlement's healer and teacher, her children growing strong and wild in the mountain freedom. Ezekiel served as guide, protector and steady presence, his wisdom helping the settlement navigate conflicts and challenges. The triplets, named Sarah, Eleanor and Jacob, grew into remarkable individuals. Sarah inherited her father's connection to the wilderness and his medical skill. Eleanor developed her mother's intellectual curiosity and way with words. Jacob combined both parents' strengths, becoming a natural leader in the young community. All 3 children knew the story of their birth, understood they were living proof that worth couldn't be measured by anyone's limitations or others' judgments. When the triplets were 7 years old, a visitor arrived at the settlement, a well-dressed woman who introduced herself as Margaret Ashford, a writer for a Boston newspaper. "I'm researching a story," she explained to Catherine as they sat in the settlement's main hall, now a proper building with glass windows and a stone fireplace, "about women who've defied society's expectations and built extraordinary lives. Your story has become somewhat legendary, but I wanted to hear the truth from you directly." Catherine considered the question carefully, watching through the window as her children played with others in the settlement, their laughter ringing across the valley. "The truth," she finally said, "is that I was told I was worthless because I couldn't fulfill one biological function. My father believed that punishment, exile to the wilderness with a man he considered savage, would teach me the full extent of my worthlessness." She smiled, an expression of deep contentment. "Instead, it taught me that worth is determined by how we live, how we treat others, what we build with our lives. It taught me that love isn't about meeting someone's expectations, but about being valued for exactly who you are." "And the children?" Margaret asked, glancing at the medical reports Catherine had shared. "Multiple physicians declared you sterile. How do you explain their existence?" "I don't explain it," Catherine replied honestly. "Perhaps the doctors were wrong from the beginning. Perhaps my body healed once I was free from the constant stress and shame. Perhaps it's simply a miracle. What I know is this: I was dead inside when I arrived here, convinced I had no value and no future. Ezekiel gave me space to discover I was wrong about myself. Together we built something real. Do you ever regret it?" Margaret pressed. "Do you ever wish you'd stayed in Boston society, found another way?" Catherine thought of her life before the mountains, the endless humiliations, the feeling of being perpetually judged and found wanting, the hollowness of existing solely to meet others' expectations. Then she thought of her life now, the honest work, the genuine partnership with Ezekiel, the community they were building, the children who shouldn't exist but did, thriving and free. "Not for a single moment," she said firmly. "My father thought he was punishing me by sending me away. He thought he was condemning me to a life of suffering and obscurity. Instead, he accidentally gave me the greatest gift imaginable, the chance to discover who I truly was, beneath all the judgments and limitations others had placed on me. He meant to destroy me, but he saved me instead." As Margaret left the settlement days later, her notebooks full of interviews and observations. She carried with her a story that would eventually inspire countless women trapped in circumstances that told them they were worthless. The story of Catherine Harrington Thornton became a symbol of transformation, proof that worth couldn't be determined by others' measurements or society's narrow definitions. On the 20th anniversary of Catherine's arrival in the mountains, the settlement held a celebration. Nearly 200 people now called the valley home, a thriving community with its own school, medical clinic, trading post and chapel. The triplets, now 20 years old, had each found their own paths. Sarah was training as a frontier physician, Eleanor had begun writing and publishing articles about territorial life, and Jacob was becoming a respected voice in territorial politics, advocating for fair treatment of all settlers, regardless of their pasts. That evening, as the celebration wound down and the valley filled with firelight and music, Catherine and Ezekiel slipped away to a spot overlooking the settlement. From here they could see the whole valley, transformed from wilderness into a place of hope and second chances. "Do you remember what I said to you that first night?" Ezekiel asked, his arm around Catherine's shoulders. "In that cave, during the storm. You said a person's worth isn't measured by one thing," Catherine recalled, "that you'd seen people who could make babies but couldn't make a life, and others who built something real without children of their own." "I was trying to offer you comfort," Ezekiel admitted. "I truly believed you were sterile, that we'd build our life without children. I wanted you to know that was enough for me, that you were enough." "And then the universe laughed at both of us," Catherine said, smiling. "Gave us not one child but 3, just to make absolutely certain we understood that doctors don't know everything, that life surprises us when we least expect it." "The children are wonderful," Ezekiel agreed. "But Catherine, I need you to know, you were enough before they came. You've always been enough exactly as you are." Catherine turned to face her husband, this mountain man who had been presented with damaged goods and chose to see a person worth saving. His beard was now more silver than dark, his face deeply lined by weather and time, but his pale blue eyes still held that same measuring quality, still saw past surfaces to the truth beneath. "I know," she said softly. "That's the real miracle, Ezekiel, not the children, though they're precious beyond words. The real miracle is that you taught me to see myself as enough. Everything else, the healing, the children, the settlement, all of it grew from that foundation. They stood together as darkness fell completely and stars emerged overhead, the same vast sky that had witnessed Catherine's arrival in shame and now looked down on her triumph. In the distance they could hear their children's voices joining others in song, the sound carrying across the valley like a promise. What had begun as punishment had become redemption. What had been meant as an ending had become the greatest beginning. And the daughter, who was supposedly worthless, had become the foundation of a community, the mother of 3, and proof that sometimes the harshest judgments are the most completely wrong. In losing everything she had been told to value, Catherine Harrington had found what actually mattered: genuine love, honest work, true partnership, and the freedom to define her own worth on her own terms. Her father had tried to teach her a lesson in humiliation, but the only lesson learned was that cruelty sometimes plants the seeds of its own defeat, and that redemption often comes from the most unexpected sources. The mountains that were meant to be her prison had become her salvation, and the mountain man who was meant to be her punishment had become the love of her life and the father of her impossible children. But the story of Catherine and Ezekiel's triumph wasn't without its trials, moments that tested everything they had built and proved that redemption is never a single moment, but a continuous choice. The year the triplets turned 11, a drought struck the territory with devastating force. Springs that had flowed for generations dried to trickles, game became scarce, and the settlement faced its first true existential crisis. Catherine watched families she had welcomed begin to despair, children going hungry despite careful rationing, gardens withering in the relentless sun. One scorching August afternoon, as Catherine tended to a feverish child in the medical clinic, a rider arrived from the territorial capital with an offer that seemed like divine intervention. A wealthy land developer named Harrison Blackwell wanted to purchase the entire valley, offering enough money to relocate everyone to established towns with guaranteed water supplies. The amount he proposed was staggering, enough to ensure every family's comfort for years. That evening, the settlement gathered in the main hall to discuss the offer, tensions running high. "We'd be fools to refuse," argued Marcus Webb, a former Boston banker who had come west after embezzlement charges ruined him. His 2 children were among the thinnest in the settlement, and desperation edged his voice. Blackwell's offering us salvation. We can start fresh somewhere with actual civilization, actual security. Others murmured agreement, their faces gaunt from reduced rations and constant worry. Catherine felt the weight of responsibility crushing her chest. This community existed because of her inheritance, her vision. If they failed now, if they had to abandon everything they'd built, whose fault would that be? Ezekiel stood, his presence commanding immediate attention despite his typically quiet demeanor. "Before we decide," he said carefully, "I think we should know why Blackwell wants this particular valley so desperately. In my experience, when rich men offer huge sums for seemingly worthless land, they know something we don't." He turned to Catherine. "Your inheritance gave you connections back east. Could you investigate?" Catherine spent the next 3 days writing urgent letters and sending telegrams through Fort Laramie, calling in favors from her late father's business associates, who had grudgingly stayed in contact. The answers that came back made her blood run cold. Blackwell wasn't interested in the valley for settlement. His surveyors had found evidence of significant silver deposits in the surrounding mountains. He planned to strip mine the entire area, destroying the valley's water sources permanently and leaving behind a poisoned wasteland. The generous offer was designed to look like charity, while actually being theft, purchasing their home for a fraction of its true value. When Catherine shared this information with the settlement, fury erupted. People who had been ready to sell suddenly felt betrayed, manipulated. But fury didn't solve their immediate problem. They still had no water, no rain, and rapidly depleting supplies. "We fight," declared Sarah, now 11 years old, but already showing the fierce determination that would define her life. "Mama, you taught us that worth isn't determined by what others say about us. This valley is worth fighting for." "With what?" Marcus Webb demanded bitterly. "Hope and determination don't make rain fall, little girl." The settlement seemed on the verge of fracturing, despair and anger threatening to destroy what drought couldn't. That night, Catherine couldn't sleep. She walked through the settlement in darkness, past the clinic where she'd healed countless ailments, past the school where Eleanor loved to read to younger children, past the meeting hall where Jacob had given his first public speech about justice and fairness. Every building represented someone's second chance, someone's redemption. She couldn't let it end this way. She found Ezekiel sitting alone by the main well, now dry except for a few inches of muddy water at the bottom. "I've been thinking about the old Shoshone stories," he said quietly as she sat beside him, "about the hidden spring in the high valley, the one the elders said their ancestors used during the great droughts." Catherine knew the story. It was considered legend, a myth about water that flowed from deep within the mountain, pure and endless. No one had found it in living memory. Most people assumed it never existed. "That's 3 days' hard climb into territory we've never explored," Catherine said, "and that's if the spring even exists." "I know," Ezekiel replied, "but I also know that desperation makes people do foolish things. If we don't give them hope, they'll sell to Blackwell. And I can't watch this place be destroyed for silver that'll run out in 5 years, leaving nothing but poison behind." He took her hand. "Come with me. Let's find this spring together, or at least die trying." The decision to search for the legendary spring was met with skepticism bordering on mockery. Marcus Webb openly called it a fool's errand, a desperate fantasy that would waste precious time and resources. But others, particularly those who had come to the settlement as last resort, understood the symbolism. If redemption was possible for broken people, perhaps it was possible for dying land. Catherine and Ezekiel prepared for the expedition with methodical care, knowing they might not return. The triplets, old enough to understand the stakes, helped pack supplies with grim determination. "You come back," Jacob ordered his parents, trying to sound commanding but unable to hide his fear. "You promised you'd be here when I'm old enough to officially join the Territorial Council. You have to come back." "We will," Catherine promised, though she couldn't know if it was a lie. She held her children close, memorizing the feel of them, just in case. "Take care of each other. Eleanor, keep reading those books. Sarah, keep studying medicine. Jacob, keep fighting for what's right. No matter what happens to us, you 3 remember. You're proof that impossible things happen every day." The climb into the high country was brutal. Ezekiel's knowledge of the mountains kept them alive, but barely. They moved through territory that seemed designed to kill humans, sheer cliffs where one wrong step meant death, passes so narrow they had to move single file, while avalanche debris from years past served as grim warning. On the fourth day, when their water was nearly gone and Catherine's hands were bleeding from climbing, she considered suggesting they turn back. Then Ezekiel stopped suddenly, his head tilted, listening. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. Catherine strained her ears and caught it. The faint sound of running water, impossible at this elevation during drought, but unmistakable. They followed the sound through a crack in the rock face barely wide enough for them to squeeze through, emerging into a hidden valley so beautiful it seemed like a dream. A spring burst from the mountainside, crystal clear and flowing strong, feeding a small pool that had never known drought because it was fed from deep aquifers insulated from surface conditions. Catherine fell to her knees beside the water, weeping with relief and disbelief. "It's real," she sobbed. "It's actually real." Ezekiel was already examining the spring's flow, his practiced eye assessing volume and consistency. "There's enough here," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "If we can engineer a way to channel this down to the settlement, there's enough to sustain everyone through the drought and beyond." They spent 2 more days surveying the valley, mapping a route for an aqueduct, collecting water samples to ensure purity. When they finally descended back to the settlement, they carried not just full water skins but renewed hope. The construction of the aqueduct became a community effort that united the settlement like nothing before. Even Marcus Webb, shamed by his earlier despair, worked alongside others to dig channels and lay pipeline cobbled together from wood, clay, and metal salvaged from abandoned mining camps. Catherine coordinated the labor, drawing on organizational skills learned managing her father's Boston household, now applied to frontier engineering. Ezekiel guided the technical aspects, ensuring proper grade and flow. The children, including the triplets, formed bucket brigades to transport materials up the mountain. When Harrison Blackwell arrived personally to collect on what he assumed would be an easy purchase, he found a settlement transformed. Water flowed through the new aqueduct, gardens were being replanted, and the community was unified in defiant prosperity. His face darkened with rage when he realized his scheme had failed. "This isn't over," he threatened. "I'll find another way to take what should be mine." "There's nothing here that belongs to you," Catherine replied calmly, though her heart hammered with fear. "This land was worthless when we found it. We made it valuable through work and love. You can't buy that." Blackwell's response was swift and vicious. He used his political connections to challenge the settlement's land claims, arguing that Catherine's purchase hadn't included mineral rights. He filed lawsuits, bribed territorial officials, and even hired men to sabotage the aqueduct. The settlement found itself in a legal and physical war against an enemy with far more resources. Catherine watched in anguish as the paradise they'd built came under siege, wondering if redemption was always temporary, always vulnerable to those who valued silver over souls. The turning point came when Eleanor, now 12 and already showing remarkable talent for investigation and writing, discovered documentation in the territorial archives proving that Catherine's original land purchase had indeed included all mineral rights. The papers had been deliberately misfiled, almost certainly by one of Blackwell's paid allies. But Eleanor's persistence, inherited from her mother's determination and her father's methodical thoroughness, uncovered the truth. Jacob, demonstrating political instincts beyond his years, personally delivered the documentation to the territorial governor, making a passionate speech about justice, redemption, and the right of people to build new lives without being exploited by the wealthy. The governor, a man who had himself come west after scandal in his past, was moved by Jacob's eloquence and Catherine's story. He ruled decisively in the settlement's favor, additionally stripping Blackwell of several other land claims obtained through similar fraudulent means. The victory was complete, and the settlement's future was secured. But more than that, the trial had demonstrated something crucial. The community wasn't just Catherine and Ezekiel's creation anymore. It had become genuinely self-sustaining, with the next generation already stepping forward to defend and improve what their parents had built. That night, as the settlement celebrated their legal victory with a feast built from autumn's harvest, irrigated by the miraculous spring, Catherine found herself overwhelmed by emotion. Sarah approached, carrying her mother's medical bag with practiced ease. "Mrs. Patterson's baby is coming early," she announced calmly, already mentally cataloguing what would be needed. I've sent Jacob to fetch hot water and clean cloth. Eleanor's keeping the other children calm. Shall we go? Catherine followed her daughter to the berthing, watching with pride and bittersweet awareness as Sarah demonstrated skills far beyond her 12 years, offering comfort and assistance with Ezekiel's gentle confidence and Catherine's practical knowledge. The baby, a healthy girl despite arriving 3 weeks early, was named Hope Thornton Patterson in honor of the family that had given the settlement its second chance. As Catherine held the newborn, she reflected on the impossible journey that had led to this moment. "You know what's strange," she said to Ezekiel later, as they walked home through the settlement's torch-lit paths. "If even one thing had been different, if my father had chosen any other punishment, if you had refused his offer, if the physicians had been right about my sterility, if we had given up during the drought, none of this would exist. Every person here, every child born in this valley, exists because of a chain of events that started with my father's cruelty. That's the mystery of it," Ezekiel replied thoughtfully. "The worst moments of our lives sometimes plant seeds for the best. Your father meant to destroy you, but his cruelty gave you freedom to become who you were meant to be. My wife's death drove me to the mountains, where I eventually found you. Pain and redemption are sometimes the same coin, just different sides." The settlement continued to grow and thrive. By the time the triplets reached 16, over 300 people called the valley home, and Catherine's reputation as a healer had spread throughout the territories. She trained others in medicine, creating a school that combined traditional frontier remedies with modern medical knowledge. Ezekiel established a guide service that helped newcomers safely navigate the mountains, his expertise saving countless lives. But their greatest legacy was the settlement itself, a place where anyone could start over, where worth was measured by contribution rather than past failures, where broken people came to heal and impossibility became everyday reality. When Sarah was 17, she received acceptance to a prestigious medical school in Philadelphia, her application supported by glowing recommendations from territorial physicians who had witnessed her skills. The night before her departure, Catherine held her daughter close, terrified and proud in equal measure. "I won't be gone forever," Sarah promised. "I'll come back with real credentials, real knowledge. This settlement needs a proper doctor, and I intend to be the best physician in the territories." "You already are," Catherine said, tears streaming down her face. "But I understand the need to prove it to yourself and others. Just remember where you come from, who you are." Eleanor left 6 months later, accepting a position with a San Francisco newspaper that wanted her frontier perspective and powerful writing. Jacob stayed, becoming the settlement's first elected mayor at 19, the youngest in territorial history. He courted and married the daughter of a Shoshone chief, creating alliances between the settlement and neighboring tribes that ensured peace and mutual prosperity. Each of the triplets carried forward their parents' legacy in different ways, proof that children born from impossibility could achieve extraordinary things. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Catherine and Ezekiel stood once again overlooking the settlement, now a proper town with a name officially recognized by territorial maps, Thornton Valley. The cabin they had shared alone was now surrounded by hundreds of buildings. The spring that saved them had been engineered into a complete water system, and the community they'd founded had become a beacon for anyone seeking second chances. "Do you ever think about what your father would say if he could see this?" Ezekiel asked, his arm around his wife's still strong shoulders. Catherine considered the question seriously. "I think he'd find some way to minimize it," she finally answered. "Some way to insist I still failed because I defied him, or that the triplets don't count because they weren't born in Boston society, or that this settlement isn't as valuable as his business empire. Some people can never admit they were wrong, especially when their wrongness led to something beautiful." She leaned into Ezekiel's embrace. "But it doesn't matter what he would think. He's been dead 24 years, and I've been alive in ways he never was. That's the real victory. I love you," Ezekiel said simply, the words as powerful as the day he first spoke them. "Not because you gave me children, though they're wonderful. Not because you helped build this town, though it's remarkable. I love you because you're you, Catherine Thornton, the woman who survived impossible things and chose to thrive anyway." Catherine turned to face him fully, seeing the silver in his beard, the lines carved by decades of mountain weather, the pale blue eyes that had seen through her father's lies to the truth beneath. "And I love you," she replied, "because you taught me that love isn't about meeting expectations or fulfilling roles. It's about seeing someone completely and choosing them anyway, flaws and strengths and everything between. As the sun set over Thornton Valley, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Catherine Harrington Thornton reflected on the impossible journey from that frozen morning at Fort Laramie to this moment of complete peace. She had been called sterile, worthless, a burden, a disgrace. She had been used as punishment, discarded like refuse, sent to suffer in wilderness exile. Every physician, every societal rule, every voice of authority had proclaimed her value was zero. They had all been catastrophically, beautifully wrong. The sterile noblewoman had become the mother of triplets and the mother of an entire community, proof that the harshest judgments are often the blindest, and that redemption isn't something we find, but something we create through courage, love, and absolute refusal to accept others' limitations as our own truth. Stories that don't just entertain, but leave a mark. Subscribe, share, and above all, keep believing that true love can still change destiny, because sometimes just one decision suffices to begin again, and this was only the beginning. The next story will surprise you in ways you can't imagine. Click on the video appearing on your screen and get ready to feel even more moved.